What does it look like when a mountain valley that stood safely for centuries disappears in less time than it takes to finish breakfast? And what happens to more than 1,000 people when the water that swallows their villages gives them almost no warning at all? If this story matters to you, take a moment to like this video so more people see it, subscribe to follow how this disaster unfolds in the days ahead, and share it with someone who needs to understand what's actually happening in the Himalayas right now. This isn't a story that deserves to disappear from your feed by tomorrow. On the morning of August 26th, in a quiet stretch of the Himalayas, where a small stream called the Lende Kola runs down from the mountains, something happened that no early warning system in the region was built to catch in time. Within 30 minutes, the water level in the Trishuli River downstream rose by 9 meters. 9 meters in half an hour. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the height of a 3-story building, rising fast enough to swallow entire settlements, before most people even understood what was happening around them. This is the story of the 2026 Nepal floods, one of the deadliest disasters to strike the Himalayas in recent memory. It's a story about geography, about climate, about the price of living beneath some of the most beautiful and most unstable mountains on Earth. And it's a story that's still unfolding right now, with rescue teams combing through mud and debris, and families in more than 30 countries still waiting for news of people who simply vanished that morning. To understand how something this catastrophic could happen in the span of half an hour, you first have to understand the landscape itself. The Himalayas aren't just the tallest mountains on the planet, they're also among the youngest and most geologically active, still rising, still shifting, still carved by rivers that drop thousands of meters in elevation over remarkably short distances. Villages here often sit tucked into narrow valleys directly beneath glaciers, following settlement patterns established centuries ago, long before anyone understood how quickly a warming climate could destabilize the ice sitting above them. For generations, that arrangement worked. The rivers rose and fell with the seasons in ways people could predict and prepare for. What happened on August 26th broke entirely from that pattern. Let's start with where this happened, because the location itself explains almost everything about why the damage became so severe, so quickly. The disaster struck along the border between Nepal and the Tibet region of China in Nepal's Rasuwa district, an area of steep valleys, glacier-fed rivers, and settlements that have existed for generations in the shadow of some of the tallest mountains on the planet. The initial surge of water entered a smaller waterway called the Lende Kola, which feeds into a larger river called the Bote Koshi, which in turn feeds into the Trishuli River, the same river that carries floodwater south through Nepal, past towns, farms, and roads that millions of people depend on every single day. According to Nepal's own hydrology monitoring bodies and independent climate researchers studying the region, this catastrophic flood was triggered by a glacier collapse high in the mountains north of the border, inside Chinese territory. Specifically, researchers believe the disaster began with what's known in scientific terms as a glacial lake outburst flood, an event where a lake formed by melting glacier ice, sometimes sitting directly on top of a glacier itself, suddenly breaks free and releases an enormous volume of water all at once. When that release happens at high altitude in narrow mountain valleys with steep drops, the water doesn't simply flow. It surges, picking up rock, mud, ice, and debris as it plunges downward, turning what starts as a lake failure into something closer to a wall of destruction moving at incredible speed. This isn't a freak, one-time event confined to a single unlucky morning. It's part of a pattern that researchers monitoring the Himalayas have been warning about with increasing urgency for years. This exact same river system, the Trishuli, has now been struck by disasters like this multiple times in recent memory. Just over a year earlier, in July 2025, a similar flood tore through the same general region, triggered by a superglacial lake outburst on the Tibetan side of the border. That earlier flood killed at least 8 people, swept away the friendship bridge connecting Nepal and China, and halted cross-border trade for weeks. Officials and disaster researchers at the time warned clearly that this would not be the last such event. They were right. The 2025 flood, in hindsight, now reads almost like a smaller-scale rehearsal for what struck the same region again a year later. Engineering researchers studying the aftermath of that earlier disaster specifically flagged the danger of a much larger glacial lake sitting further upstream, warning that if it were to fail, the resulting flood could impact more than 160,000 people living downstream and cause damage estimated at over $400 million. That warning, published in the aftermath of a flood that already felt catastrophic at the time, now looks less like worst-case speculation and more like a fairly accurate preview of what communities across this river valley would eventually face. Scientists studying the Hindu Kush Himalaya region, the vast mountain range stretching across Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Nepal, Bhutan, China, and Myanmar, have described events like these as happening at what they call an unprecedented pace. As global temperatures continue rising, glaciers across this region are melting, faster than they have in recorded history. That meltwater doesn't simply disappear harmlessly into rivers, it often collects in unstable lakes, some sitting directly on the surface of glaciers themselves, held in place by little more than ice, loose rock, and debris that was never designed to function as a permanent dam. When that natural barrier fails, whether from a rockfall, an ice avalanche, or simply the accumulated pressure of too much water for too long, the results can be catastrophic, and they can happen with almost no warning at all. That's the terrifying core of what makes glacial lake outburst floods so uniquely dangerous compared to ordinary monsoon flooding. A heavy rainstorm, however severe, usually gives some warning. Clouds gather. Rain falls for hours before rivers rise to dangerous levels. A glacial lake outburst offers none of that. One moment, a mountain valley looks the way it always has. The next moment, tens of thousands of cubic meters of water, ice, and rock are moving downhill at speeds that leave almost no time to react, let alone evacuate. Let's talk about what actually happened on the ground once that wall of water began its journey south. In Nepal's Rasuwa district, some of the worst damage struck the settlements of Timur and Siabrubesi, communities that sit along key routes connecting Nepal to Tibet, routes used for generations by traders, pilgrims, and more recently, a growing stream of tourists drawn to the region's dramatic mountain scenery. These are not isolated, forgotten hamlets. They function as genuine hubs of daily life along one of the most traveled corridors between Nepal and China, places with guest houses, small shops, customs facilities, and communities that had, until that morning, weathered decades of ordinary monsoon seasons without facing anything close to this scale of destruction. Further downstream, the flooding reached into Nepal's Nuwakot and Dhading districts, damaging homes, roads, and other critical infrastructure across an area far larger than the initial glacial collapse itself. At least 19 bridges were destroyed, roughly 40 kilometers, close to 25. Miles of roads were simply washed away, along with the connections they represented, to schools, to markets, to hospitals, to family members living just a few villages apart, who could once reach each other easily and now cannot. Power projects along the river were damaged as well, cutting electricity to communities already struggling to cope with the immediate physical destruction surrounding them. On the other side of the border, inside Tibet, the damage was equally severe. A major land crossing known as the Gairong Port, one of the most important trade hubs between Nepal and China, handling roughly a third of all trade between the two countries as recently as 2024, was completely wiped away. Satellite imagery comparing the site before and after the flood shows something almost impossible to process at a glance. A bustling, structured border crossing simply erased, replaced by a churned landscape of mud, debris, and destroyed infrastructure. This wasn't a minor trade route. It was a critical artery connecting two economies, and in a matter of hours it stopped existing in any functional sense. If you're starting to grasp just how much force was involved in this disaster, and how a single glacial collapse hundreds of kilometers from any major city could ripple outward to affect international trade routes, family reunions, and entire regional economies, you're beginning to understand why this story deserves far more attention than a single scrolling headline can offer. If you want to keep following this story as new details emerge, subscribing genuinely helps this reach more people who need to see it. Now, let's talk about the human cost, because behind every statistic in this disaster is a person, a family, a community trying to make sense of what happened to them. As of the most recent reporting, at least 353 people have died in Nepal alone, with 826 more still listed as missing by Nepali police. Across the border in Tibet, Chinese state media has confirmed at least 3 deaths, with an additional 558 people reported missing on that side of the border as search efforts continue. Put those numbers together, and you're looking at more than 1,300 people unaccounted for across both countries, following a disaster that unfolded within the span of roughly 30 minutes at its most intense point. Among those missing are people from more than 30 different countries, a detail that reveals just how significant this region has become as a global tourism and trekking destination in recent years. Nepal's own Ministry of Culture and Tourism reported that approximately 579 tourists, more than 400 of them foreign nationals, were unaccounted for in the immediate aftermath. Among the A'andas, missing were more than 140 Indian nationals, dozens of Australians, and travelers from Malaysia, the Netherlands, Portugal, South Africa, South Korea, the United Kingdom, and the United States. It's worth pausing here to think about what that actually means. This wasn't simply a disaster affecting Nepali villagers and remote mountain communities, tragic enough on its own. This was a disaster that reached into the lives of families scattered across every continent, people who had traveled to the Himalayas for adventure, for spiritual reflection, for the simple, universal desire to see some of the most beautiful mountains on earth with their own eyes. Many of them never had a chance to understand what was happening before the water arrived. Consider what a normal August morning in this part of Nepal usually looks like. Trekking season draws visitors from across the world to this exact region, drawn by trails leading toward Langtang National Park and the dramatic mountain scenery surrounding it. Guest houses along these routes fill with travelers exchanging stories over breakfast, porters loading gear for the day's trek ahead, local guides mapping out routes they've walked dozens of times before. For the people caught in this disaster, whether local residents or visitors from thousands of kilometers away, there was almost certainly no meaningful window between recognizing danger and the water actually arriving. The 9-meter rise in 30 minutes wasn't a warning sign anyone could act on. It was simply how fast the disaster itself unfolded. Nepal's own security forces have not been spared from this tragedy either. Police spokesperson Abhi Narayan Kafle confirmed that 28 police personnel remain unaccounted for, officers who were likely stationed in the affected areas, doing the difficult, often thankless work of maintaining order and assisting travelers in one of the most remote and challenging terrains anywhere in the world. The scale of this disaster has forced Nepali authorities to take extraordinary precautionary measures even as search and rescue operations continue. Police have publicly called on all citizens across the country to avoid going anywhere near rivers, streams, or any location officials have identified as high risk, warning that the danger from this disaster is far from over. Nepal remains in the middle of its monsoon season, and officials have made clear that additional storms and potentially additional flooding events remain a very real possibility in the days and weeks ahead. There's another layer to this crisis worth understanding clearly, because it reveals just how quickly a natural disaster can become entangled with a very different, very modern problem. Nepali authorities have specifically and repeatedly asked the public not to circulate misinformation, disinformation, or deepfakes related to this disaster, urging citizens instead to rely exclusively on official government sources for verified information. In the chaotic hours and days following a catastrophe of this scale, false reports, fabricated images, and misleading claims can spread even faster than the floodwaters themselves, adding confusion and panic to communities that are already dealing with genuine, overwhelming loss. That a government dealing with an active humanitarian crisis felt compelled to issue this kind of warning tells you something important about the information environment surrounding disasters in the current era, where a single manipulated photo or false rumor can complicate rescue efforts and traumatize families even further. Before we go further into the rescue efforts and the broader questions this disaster raises, it's worth sitting with something else entirely. Among the missing and among the dead are people who will likely never be fully accounted for, not because anyone has stopped looking, but because of the sheer physical reality of what a flood like this does to a landscape. Bodies, when caught in this kind of violent, debris-filled water, can be carried extraordinary distances, buried under meters of mud and rock, or swept into river systems that stretch for hundreds of kilometers before reaching anywhere search teams can realistically access. For many families, the coming weeks and months will bring not closure, but a prolonged, agonizing uncertainty that may never fully resolve. Rescue and recovery operations are currently underway across both affected countries, involving Nepal's army, its armed police force, and international support wherever it can be coordinated across the difficult, mountainous terrain. But the same geography that made this disaster so devastating in the first place is now making rescue efforts extraordinarily difficult. Roads that once connected these communities to the outside world are gone. Bridges that rescue vehicles and supply convoys would normally use no longer exist. In many cases, reaching survivors, or reaching the sites where the missing were last known to be, requires helicopter access, weather permitting, in a region where weather conditions can change rapidly and dangerously with very little warning. Search teams working in this kind of terrain face a grim, physically exhausting set of challenges that rarely make it into news coverage focused primarily on casualty figures. Debris fields left behind by a flood, this powerful, often stretched for kilometers, filled with mud dense enough to trap rescue equipment, boulders large enough to have been carried significant distances by the force of the water, and the twisted remains of buildings, vehicles, and infrastructure that offer no clear indication of what lies buried beneath them. Search, dogs, thermal imaging equipment, and manual excavation all play a role in operations like this, but progress is inevitably slow, measured in meters covered per day, rather than the kind of rapid area searches possible in more accessible terrain. This isn't the first time this exact challenge has played out in this exact region. During the 2025 flood along this same river system, search efforts were significantly hampered by poor weather that prevented helicopter reconnaissance for critical stretches of time, delaying both rescue operations and even the basic scientific work needed to understand what had caused the disaster in the first place. Disaster researchers have noted the same pattern repeatedly across Himalayan glacial flood events, remote, high altitude, hard-to-reach locations that make even documenting the scale of destruction a genuine challenge, let alone mounting an effective, timely rescue response. There's a particularly heartbreaking detail buried within the broader statistics of this disaster that deserves specific attention. According to reporting on the affected region, at least 17,000 children have been impacted by this flooding event, whether through displacement, the loss of family members, damage to schools and community infrastructure, or the broader disruption to daily life that a disaster of this magnitude inevitably brings to any community it touches. 17,000 children in a region where recovery infrastructure, hospitals, mental health support, and rebuilding resources are already limited even in ordinary times, now face an uncertain path forward, shaped by a disaster most of them will remember for the rest of their lives. This is exactly the moment in a story like this worth pausing to reflect on, rather than rushing past. Numbers like 353 deaths, or 826 missing, or 17,000 children affected can start to feel abstract the more they're repeated. But each one of those numbers represents an individual story, a person who woke up on an ordinary morning in August, went about whatever routine their day usually held, and had that routine violently interrupted by forces of nature moving faster than any warning system could reasonably have caught in time. Now let's step back and ask the harder question underlying this entire disaster. Why does this keep happening, specifically in this region, and specifically along this river system? The honest answer involves both geography and a rapidly changing climate working together in ways that are becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The Himalayas are home to some of the largest concentrations of glacial ice outside the polar regions, ice that has, for thousands of years, remained relatively stable, locked in place by consistently cold temperatures at extreme altitude. As global average temperatures have risen, the stability has begun breaking down. Glaciers across the Hindu Kush Himalaya region are retreating and melting at rates that would have seemed extreme just a generation ago. That meltwater has to go somewhere. And increasingly, it collects in glacial lakes, some forming directly on the surface of glaciers themselves in what scientists call superglacial lakes, others forming behind natural dams made of loose rock and ice debris left behind as glaciers retreat. Both types of lakes share a critical, dangerous weakness. The barriers holding them in place were never designed by nature to function as permanent, stable dams. They're essentially accidents of glacial retreat, unstable formations of ice and rock that can hold enormous volumes of water for years, sometimes decades, before suddenly failing without meaningful warning. When they do fail, whether triggered by an earthquake, a landslide, an avalanche, or simply the accumulated pressure of too much water pressing against too little structural integrity, the released energy can be almost unimaginable, sending millions of liters of water along with everything it picks up along the way, crashing down mountain valleys. At speeds few communities could realistically outrun. Researchers at organizations like the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development, based in Nepal's capital region, have been tracking this exact pattern with growing alarm for years. Their analysis of last year's flood along this same river system concluded, based on satellite imagery, that a superglacial lake drainage on the Tibetan side of the border was the direct trigger. That lake, before draining, covered roughly 0.74 square kilometers. Afterward, satellite measurements showed it had shrunk to around 0.6 square kilometers, a change small enough to sound almost insignificant on paper, but representing an enormous sudden release of water into a river system utterly unprepared to absorb it. The science behind why these lakes form in the first place is worth understanding, because it explains why this risk keeps growing rather than staying constant year over year. As glaciers retreat under warming conditions, they often leave behind depressions in the landscape, natural basins carved by decades or centuries of ice movement. Meltwater collects in these depressions, sometimes held back by walls of loose glacial debris called moraines, sometimes sitting directly on the surface of the glacier itself in pools that grow larger each melt season. Neither of these barrier types was ever shaped by geological forces designed for long-term stability. They're essentially temporary accidents of a retreating glacier, and as more glaciers retreat further and faster each year, more of these unstable lakes form across the region, expanding the total footprint of risk communities downstream have to contend with. Experts studying this broader pattern across the Himalayas describe these glacial lake outburst floods as increasing at what they specifically call an unprecedented pace. That phrase, unprecedented pace, isn't scientific hedging or cautious academic language. It's a direct acknowledgement that what communities across this region are now experiencing represents something genuinely new a shift in the fundamental risk landscape these mountains present, driven by forces largely outside any single community's or even any single country's ability to control. This raises an uncomfortable but necessary question worth sitting with. Communities in Nepal's mountain districts have lived alongside these rivers, these glaciers, and these mountains for countless generations. Traditional knowledge, passed down across centuries, taught people where it was safe to build, which valleys carried genuine risk during monsoon season, and how to read the warning signs nature typically provided before a disaster struck. But glacial lake outburst floods, particularly ones originating from increasingly unstable glaciers hundreds of kilometers away across an international border, don't follow the patterns that traditional knowledge was built around. They represent a genuinely new category of risk, one that even sophisticated modern monitoring systems struggle to predict with the kind of advance, warning that could actually save lives. If you've made it this far into the story, you're already engaging with this disaster on a deeper level than most casual coverage allows for, and that matters, because understanding why disasters like this keep happening is the first step toward genuinely addressing them, rather than simply mourning them after the fact. If this kind of in-depth breakdown is what you come here for, drop a comment letting me know what you'd want covered next, and consider subscribing so you don't miss how this story develops. Let's talk about what comes next, both immediately and in the longer term, because the challenges facing this region extend far beyond the current search and rescue effort. In the immediate term, Nepal faces the enormous logistical challenge of rebuilding critical infrastructure. 19 destroyed bridges, 40 kilometers of washed away roads, damaged power projects, all in some of the most difficult remote terrain on the planet. All while the monsoon season that likely contributed to this disaster's severity continues, with additional rainfall and additional flood risk remaining a genuine possibility in the weeks ahead. The economic dimension of this disaster is significant as well, and it extends well beyond the immediate physical damage. The Gairong port, the trade hub wiped away by this flood, represented a critical economic connection between Nepal and China, handling a substantial share of all cross-border trade between the two nations. Its destruction doesn't just represent lost infrastructure. It represents disrupted supply chains, delayed goods, and economic uncertainty for businesses and communities on both sides of the border who depended on that crossing functioning reliably. For a landlocked country like Nepal, where reliable trade routes to neighboring economies carry outsized importance for everyday commerce, losing a crossing of this significance sends effects rippling well beyond the immediate disaster zone into markets and supply chains hundreds of kilometers away. Rebuilding infrastructure of this scale, in this kind of terrain, typically takes not weeks or months, but years. And that's assuming the underlying glacial instability that caused this disaster doesn't produce another similar event before reconstruction can even meaningfully begin. There's also the longer, harder question of prevention, one that researchers and disaster risk experts have been raising with increasing urgency following each successive flood event in this region. Nepal, alongside international partners and organizations focused on mountain disaster risk, has been working to identify and monitor potentially dangerous glacial lakes across the Himalayas, assessing which ones pose the greatest risk of catastrophic failure and which communities downstream face the greatest exposure to that risk. But this kind of monitoring work is expensive, technically demanding, and made significantly more difficult when the lakes posing the greatest risk site across an international border, in terrain that's remote even by Himalayan standards, requiring genuine cross-border cooperation between governments that don't always share information or coordinate disaster response as seamlessly as the shared river systems connecting their territories might require. Some early warning systems do exist for specific high-risk glacial lakes across the region, typically involving sensors that monitor water levels and can trigger alerts if a lake begins draining unexpectedly. But these systems remain limited in coverage, expensive to install and maintain in such remote, high-altitude terrain, and entirely dependent on the specific lake, in question already being identified as high risk before any monitoring equipment gets installed in the first place. When a disaster originates from a lake that wasn't previously flagged as a priority concern, which appears to be part of what happened in this case, no amount of existing infrastructure can provide the warning communities downstream would need to evacuate safely in time. Disaster risk researchers studying the Himalayas have been direct about what they believe the future likely holds if current climate trends continue. Nepal, they've warned, will very likely face more major glacial lake outburst floods in the years ahead, each one carrying the potential for exactly this kind of catastrophic, sudden loss of life and infrastructure. The formation of new glacial lakes across the Himalayan region has been accelerating in recent years, a direct consequence of continued glacial melt driven by rising global temperatures, meaning the total number of potentially dangerous lakes requiring monitoring and risk assessment is itself growing every single year, even as resources available for that monitoring work remain limited. This is really the sobering core of what this disaster represents. beyond the immediate tragedy unfolding in Nepal and Tibet right now. It's a preview, in the starkest possible terms, of a risk that's likely to keep recurring and potentially keep intensifying across one of the most geologically dramatic and increasingly unstable mountain ranges on the planet. The people living in these valleys didn't create the conditions driving glacial retreat across the Himalayas. Global emissions, accumulated over more than a century by countries and industries thousands of kilometers away from these remote mountain communities, bear the overwhelming share of responsibility for the warming trends reshaping these glaciers. But it's these communities, farmers, traders, mountain guides, families who have called these valleys home for generations, who are absorbing the actual, immediate, devastating consequences. As search and rescue operations continue across Nepal and Tibet in the days ahead, the death toll and the number of confirmed missing will almost certainly continue shifting, as they typically do in the aftermath of disasters this large and this geographically complex. Some of those currently listed as missing will hopefully be found alive, in villages temporarily cut off by damaged roads, or sheltering in areas rescue teams simply haven't reached yet. Others, tragically, based on the historical pattern of similar disasters and similarly difficult terrain, may never be conclusively accounted for at all. What remains clear, regardless of how the final numbers eventually settle, is that this disaster has exposed, in the most painful way imaginable, just how vulnerable communities across the Himalayas have become to a changing climate, reshaping the very glaciers these communities have lived beside for generations. The Trishuli River, the Pote Koshi, the Lenda, Kola, names that likely meant little to most people outside this specific region just a week ago, are now at the center of a story that connects local tragedy to a genuinely global pattern, one playing out with increasing frequency across mountain ranges from the Andes to the Alps to the Himalayas, wherever glacial ice meets a warming world and unstable water above meets vulnerable communities below. So here's the question worth sitting with as this story continues to develop in the days and weeks ahead. When a disaster's root cause sits hundreds of kilometers away across an international border, driven by global forces no single community or even single nation can fully control on its own, what does genuine protection for the people living in its path actually look like? Better monitoring systems, certainly. Faster, more coordinated cross-border communication between governments sharing these fragile river systems, absolutely. But beneath all of that sits a much larger, much harder question about a warming world and about which communities end up paying the earliest, steepest price for changes set in motion by forces far beyond their own mountain valleys. If this story stayed with you, subscribe so you catch the follow-up as rescue efforts continue and the true scale of this disaster becomes clearer, and share it with someone who should know what's happening in these mountains right now. For the families still waiting for news of the missing across more than 30 countries, in villages throughout Rasuwa, Nuwakot and Dhading, and in communities across the border in Tibet, none of these larger questions offer any comfort right now. What they need is information, rescue, and eventually the difficult, painful process of rebuilding lives interrupted in the span of 30 minutes on an otherwise ordinary August morning. The mountains that gave these communities their homes, their livelihoods, and their extraordinary natural beauty are the same mountains that, on this particular morning, took so much from so many with almost no warning at all. In the weeks and months ahead, as reconstruction slowly begins, and as the true final scale of this disaster becomes clearer, this moment will likely be remembered as another entry in a growing, sobering list, one that includes Uttarakhand in 2021, Rasuwa in 2025, and now the Trishuli River Basin in 2026. Each disaster on that list shares a common thread. Each one struck a community that had lived safely beside these rivers and glaciers for generations, until the specific combination of a warming climate and unstable high-altitude ice turned a familiar landscape into something suddenly, catastrophically unpredictable. Whether the next entry on that list can be prevented, or whether it simply becomes a matter of when rather than if, may ultimately depend less on what happens in these remote Himalayan valleys themselves, and more on decisions made in distant capitals and boardrooms about the pace of a warming world these mountain communities never chose, but are now living through the consequences of one flood at a time.